Hello.
Hello, Dr. Hotez. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you.
I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know you're, at least on my radar, you seem like one of the busiest guys in the world in the world. So
Life is full, what can I say?
that's
Making vaccines and fighting off the anti-vaxxers. It's
yeah. Oh my
two
gosh.
full-time jobs.
I could imagine. I do want to kind of ask you a little bit about that, but I was
Sure.
wondering, yeah, I was wondering if you could just tell me, who you are and what your background is generally and your credentials.
Sure. My name is Peter Hotez. I have a medical degree, an MD and PhD, and trained also in pediatrics and pediatric infectious diseases. And I'm a vaccine scientist. I develop low-cost vaccines for low and middle-income countries, including two COVID vaccines technologies that have now reached 100 million people in low and middle-income countries, and vaccines for parasitic infections. I like to say we make the vaccines that the big pharma companies are not interested in making because they're for the world's poorest people. So I'm a co-director of the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development with my science partner for the last 25 years, Dr. Mary Elena Batazzi, and I'm also dean of our National School of Tropical Medicine, a one-of-a-kind school that devoted to diseases of poverty globally.
That's a lot. that's that's a lot on your plate. And what are you currently working on? It seems like you've got a lot, juggling a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, well, we're trying to advance our entire vaccine portfolio now that our COVID vaccine technology has reached almost 100 million people in India and Indonesia through Corbevax, that was licensed to Biological E in India, and Indovac through Biopharma in Indonesia. That's really exciting, very gratifying that we provide a proof of concept that we could do this with no patent, minimizing strings attached, that there's another pathway that can bypass the multinational pharma companies. But now we need to make the XBB booster version, the low-cost XBB booster version. So that's well underway. And now we're also developing a universal coronavirus vaccine, same principle, low cost, affordable, easy to distribute. And then we're also advancing the rest of our portfolio. We have vaccines for human hookworm infection and schistosomiasis. I call these the most important diseases you've never heard of. They affect hundreds of millions of people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But we're making those vaccines and a new Chagas vaccine that's moving into phase 1 trials. And then on the other side of what I do, which is combating rising anti-vaccine activism, I have a new book that's about to be released called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, a scientist's warning, that looks at how the anti-vaccine movement has expanded and become politically motivated and adopted by political movements, and how during the COVID-19 vaccine, it led to thousands of Americans needlessly shunning vaccines and ultimately losing their lives, and why we need to combat rising anti-vaccine activism.
Wonderful. I do want to dive in deep on that topic, but first, I do also want to know, how did you become such a public-facing scientist? Especially during COVID, I felt like I saw you almost every single day. Like you're in my living room every day, whether it's CNN or, then on podcasts, you saw you all over doing the rounds. And so, how did that come about? Have you always had a good relationship with media, or how does
It's
that go?
it's come and gone in waves. For instance, during Ebola, when Ebola hit Dallas in 2014, one of the few tropical disease experts here in the state of Texas, so it made sense for me to be out there a bit. And then when COVID-19 hit, I was one of the few American scientists that was actually working on had the track record of developing coronavirus vaccines. So it made sense for me to do that. And it's something that I find meaningful, to be able to engage the public and teach the public, from a scientist perspective, from years of working on coronaviruses and coronavirus vaccines. So as opposed to a lot of the talking heads you heard on TV, who I think did a great job overall, who were generalists, and had to learn the field. I was able to hit the ground running, having worked on coronavirus vaccines for so many years.
Wonderful. And, you've recently been what I would call aggressively called out into a really aggressive call to debate RFK Jr. and about vaccines and their efficacy. And first, I wanted to hear from you in your words, what sparked that? How did that even begin?
Well, exactly what sparked it, and it's hard to know. It's interesting. A couple of days before this, Steve Bannon, of all people I've never met, publicly declared me a criminal, which is kind of interesting. And then Roger Stone weighed in, and it seemed almost like out of left field. I think with RFK Jr. and Joe Rogan, I don't know. I think by having a serious vaccine scientist engage them, I guess it would elevate their stature to. But I think for a lot of reasons, I was not inclined to do that. First of all, I dealt with RFK Jr. for many years when he came out and said that he was going to be appointed head of a vaccine commission by the Trump Foundation. I was asked by the National Institutes of Health to talk to him for the simple reason that in addition to being a vaccine scientist, I'm the parent of 4 adult kids, including Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disabilities. And the original assertion from anti-vaccine activists was to claim that vaccines cause autism. And I was out in front explaining why vaccines could not cause autism and the evidence showing that it doesn't. Ultimately, I wrote a book called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. And that made me kind of public enemy number 1 or 2 with the anti-vaccine groups, because it took a lot of the wind out of their sails. So a lot of my public engagement has been around, where there's a vacuum and no one else is speaking out. And I feel like I have the expertise and the background and the history to weigh in on those topics. So I tend to be selective on what issues I talk about in public, but clearly anything related to vaccines and combating phony anti-vaccine assertions is something that I've, learned the hard way by experience of having a front row seat to this anti-vaccine movement.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch from a distance. I would not want to be in your position. And though it's
well, on the other hand, I do find it meaningful, and here's why. If as a vaccine scientist, I did my MD and PhD in New York 40 years ago at Rockefeller University and Weill Cornell Medical College in New York, and the motto of Rockefeller translates from the Latin knowledge or science for the benefit of humanity. That's why I became a vaccine scientist, and that's what I'm doing 40 years later and making those vaccines. But at the same time now, anti-vaccine activism is now costing lives. In my new book, The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, I estimate that 200,000 Americans needlessly perished because they refused to COVID vaccines, because they were victims of this anti-vaccine disinformation. So I'm of the belief and opinion that being a vaccine scientist not only means developing new vaccines, but also if you have the expertise to combat the disinformation, because that too is killing people and not in small numbers. And so I feel blessed and lucky that I have the expertise to know how to combat this movement, which has become very sophisticated and well financed and well organized, and is so destructive. So it's meaningful for me to go up against it as well.
It feels like
but it comes at a price, right? When someone like Steve Bannon publicly calls you a criminal, there are a lot of people who believe it and heavily target me online and social media. I get horrific death threats by emails and get sent a lot of Nazi imagery and some cases actual stalkings of my home or in places where I lecture. So it does come at a heavy price, and it's unfortunate that this has become a new reality for science and scientists. It's not, the attacks are not only against the science, but biomedical scientists. And as a nation, I think it's going to be really important that we figure out how we turn that around.
Yeah. And so, you talked about how meaningful engagement and conversation is something that you signed up for as someone in your position. Why not debate RFK? I know why I argue for you not to debate him, just to be clear. As a journalist, I think I believe I know
Yeah,
the, but
there's a couple of points about that. So,
mhm.
one of the things that I say about how science is conducted, it's not classically conducted through debate. I suppose there are instances where that's been done, but we have proven approaches for science, which is that we write scientific papers and we submit them to peer-reviewed journals, and you get critical feedback, and often requiring major revisions or even rejection of the paper, and then you send it back, and then we present our findings at scientific meetings to our colleagues for their comment and peer review and criticism, and the system works really well. But to debate somebody who has no special knowledge about vaccines is it seems to me would kind of set us back. We don't typically operate science through debate, and certainly with someone who's been so consistently wrong about vaccines for decades. And I know this firsthand about Bobby, because that's what I call him, because I've interacted with him a lot at the request of the NIH several years ago. I was asked to speak to him because I do have a daughter with autism, and he was making false claims about vaccines causing autism. I did not find my discussions with him very productive. He was pretty dug in, not willing to listen to scientific evidence. And so I found it an exercise in frustration. I'm guessing he probably found it an exercise in frustration as well. And they weren't very productive. So I didn't see how going on Joe Rogan, who also has been courting anti-vaccine activists on his show to the detriment of the health of the American population, would be a useful exercise.
Mhm.
I told Joe I'd be willing to go on his show to have that discussion so he can correct some of the misinformation that he's been promoting, and but he wasn't interested in that. But to debate RFK Jr., particularly in light of the comments he's made since I declined to debate him, it makes it all the more apparent that I think I made a good decision not debating him.
Yeah, I in that sort of in the debate as a podcast host, I don't blame them in this, but it's impossible to fact check someone who's really embroiled in lies. Like it's impossible to go back to fact check in that moment someone who brings out personal anecdotes and conversations that they've had supposedly with individuals and supposedly sitting on emerging research that they've yet to bring forward somehow. It just seems like a little bit irresponsible to even platform a character like that at this point. I think.
Well, when I was having my discussions with him back in 2017, he would bring up the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. That was the original assertion written in a scientific journal, The Lancet, that was ultimately retracted. And I would go through the evidence with him that those kids who got the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine were no more likely to acquire autism than kids who didn't. But then we wound up playing this kind of Pyrrhic game of whack-a-mole, or moving the goalpost, because as soon as you went there, you said it was thimerosal preservative that used to be in vaccines, and alum in vaccines, and it became this exhausting exercise, or spacing vaccines too close together. It was hard to really even pin him down on what his concerns are. Then he said it was the HPV vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers was causing infertility or autoimmunity, and then he said vaccines were causing something called chronic illness, and so eventually it just became so vague that it was impossible to even figure out what the heck he was talking about. So and I knew it probably looked something like that on Joe Rogan. I didn't see it as a good use of my time, or really his time either.
I respect that and understand that. And, in an effort to provoke you into debate, some Elon Musk dunked on you on Twitter and essentially bullied you, saying, quote, he's afraid of public debate because he knows he's wrong. Now, when someone like an Elon Musk comes after you, a vaccine expert, and calls you out in front of 140 million people, this seems reckless to me. RFK did something similar to Paul Offit, claiming he made $186 million with Merck based on his rotavirus vaccine, I believe. And Offit later wrote it resulted in hate mail, physical altercations with activists, and death threats on himself and his children. You brought up some of that with yourself. What has this experience been like for you personally?
Well, you're right. When someone like Elon Musk, who has, more than 100 million followers on, I mean, between Elon Musk and Joe Rogan, it's just about every follower on Twitter, except the ones maybe following Taylor Swift. But other than that, between those three, it's just about every follower on Twitter, right?
Right.
So that did create a tsunami of aggression on social media and emails, and then even a physical stalking at my home, which this individual recorded. And I tried to appeal to Elon Musk. I said, Elon, this is not true, and it could be extremely damaging. I mean, look, he knows about cars and he knows about rockets. He clearly knows a little bit less about social media, but he doesn't know anything about vaccines or immunizations, and it was extremely reckless of him to do that, and very destructive too. So it was this wall of, again, Steve Bannon, Roger Stone, Elon Musk, Joe Rogan, RFK Jr. It was formidable. And I tried to, as best I could, explain the rationale for it, but it's tough, getting your voice heard above that volume and pitch.
I bet. It seems as though RFK's been successful at tapping into distrust.
But also, I might say, but it also, again, emphasizes the political motivations. I mean, this is clearly an attack with that's, in my view, that's politically motivated, and that's what I write about in the book. The reasons for it, who knows? I mean, why now? I mean, I know Tony Fauci, who's a friend and mentor previously, has been out of the public view a lot because he's no longer public service. It looks like they just need a new Fauci light to beat up on, and that may have something to do with it. Or my colleague, who's very super smart on a lot of matters, Molly Jongfast, was pointed out early on that, and I'm not a political scientist by any means, but she's pointed out that in a direct Trump to Biden political race, the results in 2024 would be the same as 2020, and RFK Jr. is being put out there by the far right as a third-party candidate to take Biden votes away, and that's the path to victory for Trump. And I have no way of knowing if that's true, but maybe that's one of the other potential reasons that people were so angry with me for not debating RFK Jr.
It does seem like everything is sort of saturated in some sort of political.
Yeah, well, that's because the
underpinning.
anti-vaccine movement about 10 years ago became a political movement, right? Around this libertarian concept of health freedom, medical freedom. It started getting PAC money, Political Action Committee money, from the Republican Tea Party here in Texas and elsewhere. And so it is first and foremost a political movement. That's why, you see members of the House Freedom Caucus and some prominent U.S. senators from the far right openly espousing false anti-vaccine views, why it was amplified every night during our Delta and BA1 Omicron wave in 2021, 2022. Anti-vaccine sentiments were expressed by Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham on the evening Fox News broadcast that reached over 3 million people. This was documented by Media Matters and a research group at the university in Switzerland, and that's all in the book as well. The point is, it was, we too often call this misinformation or infodemic, like it's just some random junk on the internet, and it's none of those things. It's organized, it's well financed, and it's politically motivated. And you might say, well, Peter, why are you weighing in on this? And the reason is because it's killing Americans, and that's what I always bring it back to. The reason we need to care is 200,000 Americans died because of anti-vaccine aggression and disinformation. And people in my state of Texas alone, 40,000. They were victims. They were victims. I mean, these people are, the salt of the earth. They're the people in East Texas, Central Texas, tuning into Fox News every night and believing they're elected officials. They were, and the contrarians, they were victims of this. And I think we need to talk about this so it doesn't happen again for the next pandemic, or it doesn't start to spill over into all childhood immunizations, which I think it will.
Yeah, it does seem as though we're so influenced, myself included, by narrative and storytelling. RFK, whatever you think about him, seems to have gained a lot of success and momentum. He is all over the map. I know just personally friends and family that are enamored by the guy. It seems like he's been successful at tapping into a distrust in institutions at this moment. And in particular, how these institutions have earned this distrust. Would you agree with that? Like, is there something there? And that there is a distrust? He really seems to, he's, according to one poll, leading the Democratic Party nominee for the presidential race. It seems like he's calling out into this public distrust in institutions. Do you believe that exists, or what do you think he's tapping into?
I think you're right, but the way you say it has to be modified. So he is tapping into distrust, as is Joe Rogan is tapping into distrust, as is Elon Musk. But remember who engineered that distrust. This didn't happen organically. It happened through deliberate actions of some of those same individuals, as well as elected officials in the House Freedom Caucus, who actively sought to undermine vaccines. You're seeing this by Fox News, and not only attacking the science, but attacking scientists, prominent American scientists, and portraying them as enemies of the state, or public enemies. So the distrust was not was not due to misinformation or infodemic. It was through targeted aggression from elected officials, Fox News, and contrarian intellectuals and pseudo-intellectuals. The point is, it was engineered, and that's really important to keep in mind as we talk about this.
So you don't believe that there's any playing into this message of corruption in the pharmacy industry, conflicts of interest, trying to make money on medicine, and there's no glimmer of truth there? You don't believe?
Sure. But let me give you an example of why. I think this is, far less important than people believe. For instance, one of the first things that these individuals do, as well as elected officials, is they say, I'm a shill for industry, right? That I'm secretly taking money from Pfizer, Moderna, you name it, when I haven't taken a penny, number one. Number two, in fact, we've pioneered a way to make vaccines that bypass the multinational pharma companies. We made 2 COVID vaccine technologies that reached 100 million people in India and Indonesia, providing proof of concept that it's possible to totally bypass the multinational pharma companies. Do you think they say any of that, right? If anything, right? I mean, you would think if RFK Jr. or Joe Rogan or any of those guys was really committed to this issue, they would say, hey, great job, Peter. We need more of this. How did you do it? How can we, institutionalize this to make this, to create a different route for product development? But that's not what they do. Instead, they use these old tropes that have no basis in reality. And of course, also, and unfortunately, there's a lot of unwell people who don't bother to read primary sources, and they just read the far right conspiracy sites or listen to the podcasts and attack me, quote, as a pharma shill. So a lot of that also is engineered as well. And look, I'm one of the first out there to criticize the pharma companies. After Pfizer and Moderna jacked up the prices of the mRNA vaccines. And I speak openly about the advantages and some of the disadvantages of mRNA vaccines versus other technologies. If they took $30 billion in US taxpayer money and for advanced development costs in the case of Moderna and for advanced purchase for both Pfizer and Moderna, 30 billion taxpayer dollars. And then they jack up the price times 4 to $130 a dose. I say, guys, have some situational awareness. I mean, do you want the American people to hate you? And so I'm the first to go out and say that. So yeah, there are problems, but again, there's a lot of other agendas at play that exacerbate and make things far worse, to the point where people shun vaccines and lose their lives. And again, that's why I keep bringing it back to.
Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if you could explain where this claim of linking vaccines to autism came from. There was a study in 1998 published in Lancet, correct, that was retracted, but it was also found to be fraudulent later on. And is that correct? Or could you explain where this initial narrative came from?
Yeah, it was a paper. I think it was 12 kids who got the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and which is a live virus vaccine. And the claim was that the live virus was somehow replicating in the colon, and that led to, at that time, they didn't call it autism. They called it pervasive developmental disorder, which is one of the early diagnoses that Rachel had. And it was shown to be false, and the paper was retracted eventually by the editors of the Lancet, but not till 2010. So it was a 12-year gap period, and that gave a lot of momentum to anti-vaccine groups. And although fairly quickly, by 2003, 2004, 2005, there were large scientific studies that showed that kids who got the MMR vaccine were no more likely to acquire autism than kids who didn't. And that should have ended it. But by then, you started to see anti-vaccine groups starting to monetize the internet. They were selling phony autism cures or nutritional supplements. If you go to Amazon.com and put on books on vaccinations, it's all anti-vaccine COVID conspiracy books. So they were making money. The Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is headed by my friend Imran Ahmed. And as I always like to say, it's really unfortunate that we have to have an organization called the Center for Countering Digital Hate, but they look at all of the stuff around the election, and they've looked at the vaccine issue, and they found that there was about a dozen groups that they call, or individuals that they call the disinformation dozen, who were making big time money cashing in on the disinformation. So there was a big financial motive, according to the Center for Countering Digital Hate. So they weren't taking no for an answer. So it kept on moving, as I say before, moving the goalposts on what the specific concern was. And you just went through this exhausting exercise debunking every false assertion. And it caused a lot of damage and distrust in our vaccine ecosystem. And then it became a political movement around 10 years ago and started getting PAC money and around because of health freedom, medical freedom, libertarian concepts, and especially in my state of Texas and other red states, it became very, very powerful. And that's what came off the rails during COVID-19. And now, when I report about it in the book, but Charles Gaba, the health analyst in the New York Times, has looked at this, and they found that in terms of the political leanings, that overwhelmingly those who lost their lives because they refused a COVID vaccine were victims of the disinformation living in red states, and red being Republican, blue being Democrat. The redder the county, the lower the immunization rate and higher the death rate, so much so that David Leonhardt of the New York Times just called it red COVID, and the data is really sound. And you can show this very sharp partisan divide in those who lost their lives because they refused a vaccine. And I know these people, right? I mean, I live with them here in Texas. I was giving grand rounds at Stanford Medical School a few weeks ago, and here's what I said. I said, if my car had broken down and it had a flat tire, and you gave me the choice to have that car broken down in Palo Alto, California, which is very wealthy, one of the wealthiest places in the United States, versus East Texas. I had recently given grand rounds in Tyler, Texas. I'd say East Texas in a second, because in Palo Alto, everybody go whizzing right by. I don't really know that, but to make the point. Whereas in East Texas, everybody would be fighting over who'd be the first to help you and to help you change your tire, right? These are, the salt of the earth. And they're just wonderful people. And they were, and when you go out, when I gave grand rounds, University of Texas, Tyler, East Texas, everybody had lost a loved one because they refused a COVID vaccine. It's just heartbreaking. And that's, again, why we need to care, is that these are victims of this anti-vaccine activism and aggression. And that's what stimulated me to write this newest book.
Yeah, I feel like we're so easily influenced by good storytelling, and so compelled with someone like an RFK character that is seemingly like sticking it to the man, or again, leaning into this narrative.
What's interesting
is,
in the book, I don't even think I mentioned RFK Jr. He had not become, he had kind of, I wouldn't say disappeared, but he had become much less prominent. And most of the anti-vaccine activism in the last few years has come from elected officials, from, as I mentioned, the House Freedom Caucus, some senators from the GOP House Freedom Caucus, Fox News, some of the contrarians, some governors of red states. And that's where it became really scary, because this was now embraced at the highest levels of the United States federal government and state government. So it was basically sanctioned aggression that was leading to deaths. And that really became very concerning for me.
And it seems as if the media, and at least podcasts, really played up vaccine injury. Vaccine injury does happen. There are cases, right, where people are allergic to vaccines, et cetera, but this is a far cry from linking,
I mean, I did with the New York Times early 2020, right before the pandemic. I did an op-ed piece for the New York Times, and I did it with it was an interesting collaboration with Bill Marsh, who's one of their graphics, guy who does graphics. You ever look at the Sunday Review in the New York Times, you see all those beautiful graphics. Bill Marsh does a lot of those, and in the print edition. And so we teamed up to, compare the risk of getting a vaccine versus the disease. And Bill came up with this great idea to create a box that represented 10,000 people. And in the box, you take two different boxes. One, what happens if 10,000 people get the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine versus 10,000 who get measles, right? And those who get measles, the boxes inside are huge, right? Because of illness, hospitalization, deafness, even death due to measles, as opposed to getting the vaccine, which is a little pinprick you can't even see for the risk of getting thrombocytopenia or an allergic reaction. And then we did this also for getting influenza versus the flu vaccine, or getting cervical cancer versus the HPV vaccine. I think it was a useful way to demonstrate, adverse events do occur in vaccines, but they are exceedingly rare. And not only that, they're extremely well monitored. I mean, we have in the United States, between the FDA and the CDC, the most detailed, advanced monitoring system the world has ever seen. We have both passive reporting through the vaccine adverse events reporting system that's incredibly sensitive and was able to pick up rare thrombotic thrombocytopenia events from the J&J vaccine, or myocarditis from the mRNA vaccines. But then it's any potential link is actually verified through vaccine safety data link and about 3 or 4 other systems. So the point is, we have this very robust system in place for monitoring adverse events of vaccines. So the American people should take some comfort in that, and then the warnings go out. So it's, again, the anti-vaccine activists want to ascribe any adverse event to vaccines, and number one, and number two, deny the existence of our very elaborate system to ensure that the American people are safe from getting their vaccine, safe in terms of getting their vaccinations.
So this narrative where they claim that scientists haphazardly rush through getting that COVID vaccine out to the public is false then.
Yeah, I mean the rigor that you have to go through is incredible. I mean, look at the mRNA vaccine trials. I mean, 40-60,000 participants randomized, and very rigorously done. And people should take comfort in that. And I can say from our own experience working with Biological E in India or Biopharm in Indonesia, the incredible rigor that they had to go through with their own version of the FDA. This is hard work, and for a good reason, because when you're giving a vaccine, more often than not, you're giving it to a well individual in order to prevent them from getting sick. So the safety profile has to be really pristine or as close to it as possible.
Okay. And to circle back, not to circle back, but to circle back, there is, the autism narrative is obviously completely false. And that data was fraudulent,
let me
right?
tell you why. It's not only the massive evidence showing that kids who get these vaccines don't acquire autism, but also we have an alternative narrative because we know it does cause autism. So one of the things that we did with Rachel and my wife Ann and I is we did whole exome genomic sequencing at Baylor Genetics and found Rachel's autism gene, which is a neuronal cytoskeleton, encodes for a neuronal cytoskeleton protein's mutation in a gene required for neuronal communication, as are the 100 other autism genes that have been discovered so far. And so the point is, we understand the genetic and epigenetic basis of autism, and it begins in early fetal brain development, well before kids ever see a vaccine. And that's another aspect that I talk about in the book. Vaccines did not cause Rachel's autism, which again, the anti-vaccine activists failed to mention.
Okay. And do you regret going on the Joe Rogan podcast, looking back at it?
I did it twice, actually. No, I loved it. It was great. I thought we had a meaningful both times had a meaningful discussion. I became fond of him when, even when he came to Houston he was at the Toyota Center for one of his shows. I made a point of bringing my son Dan to it. And afterwards we went backstage and talked to him, hung out, had a beer. It was terrific. So cool. I don't know the change, and then, and that was, I think the last time I went on was early 2020. And then starting in 2021, or maybe later in 2020, started bringing on these prominent anti-vaccine activists that I think caused a lot of damage. And, then I emailed him a few times to say, Joe, let me come back on and correct that misinformation. But I got no response. And then I tried him again in 2022 about, our vaccine provided this alternative to pharma. And again, no response. So I hadn't heard from him until all of a sudden he, challenged me to this debates, which is unfortunate. So, if Joe wanted me to come back on, I'd probably still do it now, because I think having a one-on-one discussion with him, we could, get some positive things done, but not with RFK Jr. there. I think it would just cause a lot of chaos. And I think I said on an interview on CNN that they would turn it into the Jerry Springer show, or for those of us who are old enough to still remember.
Sure.
Jerry Springer show.
Sure. And like I said, as a journalist, I give these podcast hosts a lot of grace, because there is the things he's claiming. There's some of it you could absolutely, someone like yourself could fact check him, but there's other things where he brings up personal anecdotes, or the information leads to him supposedly sitting on some evidence that's emerging still. And I don't know that a lot of things are unable to check.
If Joe were sincere at really getting to the truth about it, I think we could have a good discussion. If you get, with RFK Jr. around vaccines, where he'll just keep on bringing up out of left field crazy stuff about vaccines, then, that's not going to be a productive conversation.
Yeah, and it's not just vaccines.
Doesn't mean, he's not good on other issues. I mean, he's got a track record as an environmental justice expert, and that's all fine. But when it comes to vaccines, this would not be a productive conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. You sort of flip flops on that topic, specifically environmental issues. So no hard feeling. Like, how do you feel, or what do you think when you hear, Joe bring up your own personal physical fitness? I've heard him do that multiple times, and when someone links your personal fitness to your ability to be trusted as a scientist, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, no, it's embarrassing for me. It's embarrassing, and by the way, I don't look that bad. I
I was
mean,
gonna say, you don't seem to.
I got my BMI is well below 30, and I'm 65 years old. I think I'm older than Joe is, and I think I posted a picture of myself on Twitter. I said, "Hey Joe, I doubt you look this good when you're 65." So yeah, I mean, I could lose a couple of pounds, but I'm not, certainly not obese or even all that heavy, and and I do take care of myself. I try. I mean, I made a joke about junk food when I was in the show, and that's all played up,
Yeah, I know.
this bizarre way. And my wife makes sure I eat relatively well, and sometimes it's tough when you're traveling, and that gets harder, as Joe himself pointed out during the show. So yeah, that's. I mean, but again, this is part of what the far right does, is to discredit science and scientists. They look for anything they can to diminish you, and if all the with all of the FOIAs and all of the attacks and all the effort to dig up dirt on me, and if all they can come up with is that I could probably stand to lose a few pounds, and that's it, just a few pounds, then I must be doing something right too.
Well, it makes me
Oh, also my
happy.
height. They're not happy
Oh,
with my
really?
height, and they say I'm the same height as Fauci. And
Oh
I
my
say, you know
gosh.
what? I say, oh, that I can't do much about, but
I'm glad you don't take it. You're not too hard on yourself, and you don't take this stuff
well, it
too
does. It does.
personally.
It
Yeah,
does. It does mess with your head after a while.
I
All of the
bet.
aggression, and it's. I can't say it's fun, and sometimes you don't get the support from the scientific societies that I would like to get. It's Martin Luther King. Not that I'm comparing myself with Martin Luther King. He once said, "It's not so much the words of the enemies; it's the silence of the friends that becomes tough." And
Hmm.
because I think they see how I get beat up, so academic societies don't want to be out there. Some do. I'm getting more support of late, but that's also the other tough part. You don't want to feel like you're alone in this. Fortunately, I've had the backing of my bosses at Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital. They've been great, and so I'm deeply grateful for that. And my colleagues, here at work and in the lab, and there is a lot of support on Twitter. I mean, some people came out that I never out of the woodwork that I never would have thought. Mark Cuban came to my defense.
Yeah, I saw that.
And Mark Hamill come to I have Luke Skywalker. I mean, I've got a Jedi warrior on my side. So how bad can it
Yeah,
be? Right?
there you go. And are you a Mavericks fan, or since?
Well, I live in Houston, so
Oh,
but
Rockets.
I better not say too much.
Yeah.
But
uh, that's so funny. Will this change the way your behavior on social media, or do you feel
well, I've had it. Well, first of all, I think the other thing, and people ask me about public engagement, and I say, for me, social media is the least rewarding
mhm.
of all of them. I mean, my public engagement activities, outside my science and the lab meetings and the papers and the grants, I write books, I write opinion pieces, I go on cable news channels, and not so much lately, but in the past. That to me is fairly meaningful. The social media is, I find, the least rewarding of all of it. So
Mhm.
the one thing I've had to do, which I'm not happy about, and a lot of people are not happy about, is I've had to shut off my replies to accept anyone who follows me, and that's because I was just getting these wave of death threats and Nazi symbols and hangings, and it was just horrible. So I had to shut that off, and so my social media now is much less active. I basically use it to if I've written a book or a new paper or if I'm speaking somewhere, I'll announce it. But it's far less engagement than I used to, and I've had to do that. That's Elon's new version of Twitter, or whatever the heck it's called now, X.
Yeah.
In the new X world, it's I'm just not putting a lot of stuff out there like I used to, and that's fine. I mean, but
got to adapt.
I think social media has kind of seen its day, and unless we figure out a way to deal with the toxicity and the aggression, it's going to be hard for it to continue in its current form.
It seems it. Or, I hope nothing explosive happens. It just seems like explosive things are happening already, just kind of
Well,
scattered.
I think as we get closer to the 2024 election, it's not going to get better. I think this will probably get worse. Than what happens after the 2024 election, we'll see. But I think, a lot, again, so much of the aggression, at least as actively pushed by the leaders of this, is politically motivated. And so, it's interesting when I'm trying to understand all this, I wind up reading the works of political scientists and political philosophers, or talk to someone like Ruth Ben-Gad, who's at New York University, is an important history professor, has looked at the history of authoritarian regimes, or reading the writings of Anne Applebaum or Hannah Arendt. In fact, I have a chapter in the new book that looks at the similarities of what's happening now in other totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. This is what Stalin did, right? Not only discredit the science, but the scientists. And this is how, or I was in Brazil recently and speaking at the University of Sao Paulo, which is one of the top universities in Brazil. And because they just, first of all, we were doing some vaccine manufacturing in Brazil, but also, and because of the Bolsonaro regime, he was using a lot of the same approaches that the far right was using in the US against the vaccine. So it was interesting to speak on the anti-vaccine movement in the US and compare it to what was going on under Bolsonaro in Brazil. And there are a lot of similarities. So this is like a new signature of far right movements to discredit science and scientists and use anything you can.
And that's the primary motivation for your new book, then?
That's right. It's to basically say, too often we call it misinformation or infodemic, like just random junk on the internet. And it really goes into detail of how this is an organized, well-financed, and politically motivated enterprise, and how it's killed so many Americans. And to basically say, look, and it's not fun to talk about. No one wants to talk about politics, and Republicans and Democrats and liberals are conservatives. We're supposed to be politically neutral, but I haven't found a way to talk about it other than to talk about it. So I talk about it. Not that I care about your conservative views. I mean, you're entitled to those, but somehow to say, don't adopt this one. Don't adopt this anti-vaccine, anti-science stuff because it's killing too many Americans. Any of the other stuff you want to indulge in QAnon fantasies, I don't find it very worthwhile, but that's your business, right? I'm not here to tell you not to do that. I'm here to tell you, don't adopt the anti-vaccine stuff because too many of your loved ones and your colleagues have lost their lives because of it.
It's a good message. And we will not be seeing a Peter Hotez RFK Jr. debate then.
No, I don't
Okay.
think so. And
Okay.
and again, as I say, debate is not something I think of as part of how we do science. It's we have approaches for doing this through peer-reviewed publications and scientific conferences with our peers. I mean, I guess there's some examples. There's the famous Bohr and Einstein debates on the origins of matter, but again, it was done by two trusted colleagues of roughly equal knowledge and background. So that was very different. But generally speaking, that's not how we advance science. We debate 18th century Enlightenment philosophy, and we debate Rousseau and Bishop Berkeley and Immanuel Kant. We debate politics. We don't typically debate science, at least in the same way.
Excellent. And Dr. Hotez, what's next for you? You got the book and
Yeah,
continue your work, and
that's right. Well, we have a whole portfolio of vaccines we're advancing, and I'm very excited about that. Our new XBB booster of our vaccine, our universal coronavirus vaccine, our other parasitic disease vaccines in our portfolio. In the fall, I'll be the book will be out, so I have a few public speaking engagements around the book, and I'm hoping that that's in talking with audiences at universities and also in some bookstores and doing some book events. So I'm excited about that. So a lot to look forward to.
wonderful. I'm glad you're in such good spirits. I wasn't sure how you were holding up, and it's nice to see you, and it's great to talk to you and meet you. Is there anything else you want to put out there for folks before I let you go?
I think that's it. I been devoted my whole life to something called neglected diseases, and so by definition, that you have to be an optimist to get through something like that. So I think that's prepared me for taking on fights like this.
Well, I wish you the best, and this was a lot of fun. I'd love to do it again.
Sure.
I will put this out there for folks, and I'm also going to circle back with my editor. I've already got a couple article ideas potentially for the U.S. News.
Okay.
And
this is done through the auspices of U.S. News?
So it isn't. This is separate from my work with U.S. News. However, I have ownership over my interviews that I conduct, and then from there I could reshape into an article topic, pitch that to my editor, circle back with you. Yeah. And so if I, get the approval from my editor and even bring up some general thoughts to my editor, if she's on board, I would absolutely circle back with you first to discuss whether you'd want to participate in an article.
Yeah, for U.S. News, I think it'd be great.
Excellent. And we could get your book out there a little bit too, hopefully.
Great.
Wonderful. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know, like I said, you seem like a very busy guy, and I just want to say appreciate it and grateful for your time, and thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was a good discussion. I enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.
All the best.
Bye.